Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a quiet journey into something often forgotten. Not the wars or the castles, not the kings or the knights, but the slow, smoky kitchens of the Middle Ages, where hunger lingered like an unwelcome guest, and every crumb of bread told a story. So let's slow down for a while, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like for those who lived not in stone towers, but in mud cottages, where a single meal could mean the difference between strength and weakness. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the soft rustle of pages in a dusty old library. Before we start, a small favor. If you enjoy these sleepy journeys through the quiet corners of history, consider leaving a like or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners, scattered across the world, drifting off to the same story under different skies. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Picture this. The year is somewhere in the 1300s. The morning is pale and damp, and the air smells faintly of smoke and wet earth. A small village huddles beside a stream, its thatched roofs darkened with dew. Roosters cry from somewhere unseen, and a thin column of smoke twists from a cottage chimney. Someone's already up, coaxing life into a fading fire. Inside that cottage, the air is heavy with the scent of ashes and barley. A woman kneels beside the hearth, stirring a pot that hangs from an iron hook. It's not soup, not really, just warm water thickened with yesterday's scraps. A handful of oats, maybe a few wilted greens, a precious bone boiled so many times that it's more memory than meat. This is breakfast, and it's enough. For most of medieval Europe, that was the start of the day. No bacon, no eggs, no butter sizzling in a pan. Just a slow grey broth, maybe thickened into a porridge if luck allowed. You could almost hear the quiet patience of it, the bubbling, the scraping of wooden spoons against rough clay pots, the muted rhythm of survival. Bread, though, bread was everything, not the kind you'd imagine now with soft crusts and neat slices. This was coarse, heavy bread, often dark as soil, made from barley, rye or oats, whatever the harvest had given that year. Wheat was a dream for the poor. It belonged to monasteries and nobles, its golden loaves gracing tables that peasants would never see. Sometimes the bread wasn't even bread as we'd know it. There was maslin, a mix of grains ground together, sometimes with husks or weeds left in. In hard times, people stretched their flour with ground beans, acorns or even tree bark. It filled the belly, but not always kindly. A rough loaf could wear down teeth, or hide tiny bits of grit from the millstone. Little reminders that comfort was a luxury. Still, when the bread came out of the oven, steaming and rough-edged, the cottage would fill with a kind of quiet happiness. A loaf could be divided carefully, piece by piece, its warmth shared across a family. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival. And there's something beautiful in that simple honesty. Out in the fields, men and women would carry small bundles of this bread to work, wrapped in cloth, hard as stone by midday. They'd soften it with ale or water, or dip it into a thin stew at noon, and as they chewed, they'd look out over the land that both fed and punished them. The rhythm of hunger was tied to the rhythm of labour. You worked because you were hungry, and you were hungry because you worked. Let's take a moment here. Imagine the world before spices, before sugar, before the idea of eating for pleasure. Food was function, a slow engine that kept bodies moving through cold mornings and long fields. And yet, even in that simplicity, there were small joys. Sometimes a child might find an apple fallen behind the cottage, half bruised but still sweet. Sometimes a fisherman's wife might bring home a few small river fish, glinting like silver in the dawn. Sometimes someone baked bread on a festival day, and the whole village smelled like warmth and hope. That's the thing about hunger, it doesn't just create suffering, it creates meaning. When you have little, every small taste becomes sacred. Even a crust dipped in broth could feel like a feast, especially if you'd gone to bed hungry the night before. But this quiet hunger wasn't just physical, it shaped the soul of the Middle Ages. It taught patience, restraint, humility, the kind of virtues we read about in sermons and stories. People learned to bless their meals not out of piety, but because gratitude was the only seasoning they could afford. At the same time, the divide between rich and poor was written in every meal. In the manor hall, roasted meats dripped with fat, and platters gleamed with spices from faraway lands. Down below, in the cottages, families ate the same stew for days, each time a little thinner, a little less filling. It wasn't bitterness that filled them, it was endurance. A kind of quiet, stubborn hope that tomorrow's meal might be better, or at least that tomorrow would come. By midday, the smell of smoke would hang low over the village. Children might chase each other near the fields, their laughter thin but bright. Someone would fetch water from the well, carefully, because even the water wasn't always safe. It could carry sickness, or the taste of the earth. That's why ale was safer. A weak home-brewed drink barely stronger than water, but boiled, fermented, and blessed by time. Even the smallest children drank it. As evening came, the hearth would glow again. A thin pot of stew, the same as the morning, only thicker now, because time had coaxed flavour from whatever bones and roots it held. It would bubble quietly, and someone might tear the day's bread into pieces and drop them in, watching it soak, soften and vanish. And when everyone had eaten, when the pot was scraped clean, the fire would burn low and the house would fall into silence. Outside, wind would sweep through the thatch, and somewhere a dog would bark or a baby cry. The night would stretch long, and bellies would rumble quietly, not starving, not full, just alive. There's something humbling about that image, isn't there? A life where food wasn't a hobby, or a choice, but the quiet centre of existence, fragile, sacred, and hard-won. As we drift deeper into this story, we'll wander through these kitchens and fields again, see what else they cooked, how they made flavour out of famine, and how their patience shaped the very culture that followed. For now, let's end the day as they would have. A wooden bowl scraped clean, a sliver of bread saved for morning, and a candle burning low, its flame flickering against the cold stone walls. You can almost hear the sigh of a tired mother, the murmur of a prayer whispered softly into the dark, and the gentle, endless rhythm of hunger. Not cruel, just constant. Tomorrow, the pot will boil again, and life will go on. Picture this: the faint grey light of morning slipping through a small wooden shutter, dust motes swirling in the air, and the sound of a wooden spoon tapping gently against the rim of a pot. It's not a grand breakfast table we're stepping into, but a small, uneven plank balanced on rough legs, the kind of table that's seen 100 winters and probably been repaired a dozen times with bits of rope and iron nails. The peasant's table was never empty, but it was rarely full. At best, it held the day's bread, a clay bowl or two, and maybe a crock of salt or dried herbs. At worst, it held nothing but hope for the next meal. Still, this was the heart of every home, the place where families talked, shared silence, and measured time by the rhythm of meals. Let's take a seat there for a moment. You'd have to duck your head beneath the low roof beam, the air thick with smoke from the hearth. Maybe a few chickens wander underfoot, scratching at the dirt floor. The smell of damp wool and boiled grain clings to everything. Outside, you can hear a rooster call and the soft creak of a cartwheel somewhere far down the muddy path. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't have kitchens the way we imagine them today. Cooking was done over an open hearth, a fire pit lined with stones, with an iron tripod or a hook for hanging pots. There were no stoves, no ovens in most cottages, and certainly no chimneys until later centuries. The smoke simply drifted upward and out through the thatch, leaving every beam blackened with soot. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Sparks could set the whole roof ablaze, and yet that hearth fire was the soul of the house. Without it, there was no warmth, no food, no reason to gather. Meals themselves were simple, sometimes painfully so. A bowl of pottage, that thick, slow-simmered mix of grains, beans and vegetables, might appear 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes there was only one meal at all. It wasn't about breakfast, lunch and dinner. It was about surviving from sunrise to sunset on what little you had. But still, there was rhythm. Morning meant something warm to start the body moving. A scoop of yesterday's stew, a crust of bread, softened in ale or milk, perhaps a bit of onion for flavour. Midday brought the main meal, eaten when the sun was high and work paused. And when darkness fell, a smaller supper, whatever was left, shared quietly around that same wooden table. Imagine the texture of that bread, hard, uneven, baked in the village oven once a week. Each family brought its dough to the baker, marked with a small pattern carved into the top, a sign, a symbol, to know whose loaf was whose. It's easy to picture that scene, a long line of villagers, baskets on hips, chatting softly as the scent of warm bread drifts through the lane. For many, that was the week's greatest comfort. But what else sat on the peasant's table besides bread and pottage? A few things, if luck was kind. Cheese, coarse and tangy, made from goats' or sheep's milk. Eggs, when the hens were generous. Maybe a piece of salted pork hung from the rafters, shaved into stews in the smallest possible amounts. Fat was precious. It carried flavour, warmth and strength. People used every bit of an animal they could. Organs, bones, even the hooves boiled down to jelly. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. The taste of the poor was earthy, not because they wanted it that way, but because the earth was all they had. Cabbages, leeks, peas, onions and turnips made up the bulk of their diet. They grew what they could and traded for what they couldn't. And when the garden failed, they turned to the forest for mushrooms, berries, nuts, and sometimes even bark or roots, stripped from trees in desperate times. Still, there was a kind of genius in their simplicity. With a handful of barley and a few greens, they could stretch a pot of stew for days. With sourdough and salt, they could preserve a loaf longer than anyone might expect. And with nothing but ash, smoke and thyme, they could dry fish or meat that would last through the winter. It wasn't gourmet cooking, it was quiet ingenuity. Let's pause and look around that small table again. A father, shoulders broad and worn from field work, sits with his elbows resting on the wood. Across from him, his wife ladles out the stew, carefully making sure each child gets something. The oldest might get a bit more broth, the youngest a smaller chunk of bread. There's no silverware, just spoons carved from wood, sometimes even shared. The youngest child might eat from the same bowl as the mother, sitting on her lap. There's talking, but not much. Most meals were eaten in near silence, partly from hunger, partly from habit. Words didn't fill the stomach, and yet there's warmth in that silence, the warmth of being together, of knowing that somehow, despite everything, you've made it through another day. Above the table, bundles of herbs hang drying, sage, thyme, parsley, maybe a few onions braided together. They aren't decoration, they're insurance. Little bursts of taste for the bland months ahead. Salt, when they had it, was a treasure. It preserved food, healed wounds, and sometimes even served as currency. In some regions, a small pouch of salt was worth a day's labour. Occasionally, there'd be something special. Maybe a neighbour brought honey, or a merchant passed through the village selling dried fruit. A few raisins, a bit of apple. These were luxuries, the medieval version of candy, and on feast days the whole rhythm of eating changed. Tables were cleared, ale flowed, and meat. Glorious, real meat might appear. A goose, perhaps, or a pig roasted over open flame. It was more than food, it was joy. The kind that reminded people life wasn't only work and hunger, but on most days, that joy was remembered through smell, not taste. You could catch it on the wind, the faint smoke from the manor kitchen, carrying the scent of roasting fat into the village. It wasn't cruel exactly, just another reminder of how life was divided. Still, even the poorest had pride. They cleaned their bowls with bits of bread, kept their tables tidy, and often said a quiet prayer before eating. Food was sacred, not in theory, but in practice. It was the link between labour and survival, between earth and gratitude. Even when the stew was thin, they would give thanks because thin stew was still something. There's a strange comfort in imagining that. A meal without noise, without rush, without screens or clocks, just the slow rhythm of spoons, the flicker of firelight, and the murmured hope that tomorrow's bread would rise. Let's stay here a bit longer. Listen to the soft crackle of the hearth, the faint hiss as the pot settles, the sigh of someone stretching after a long day. This was the peasant's table, plain, quiet, enduring. It may not have looked like much, but it held an entire world together. When we think of history, we picture kings and battles, but the truth is, civilization was built on this very table, on the hands that kneaded dough, on the fires that simmered broth, on the patience that turned hunger into habit. And as the night falls, the family begins to drift away. The children curl near the fire, the mother sets aside tomorrow's dough, and the father closes his eyes, already half asleep, his mind drifting through fields and seasons. Somewhere, an owl calls in the distance. The candle flickers, the room breathes, and for one more night, the world feels fed. Now, if you lived in the Middle Ages, the year wasn't just marked by dates or holidays, it was measured by hunger, not in dramatic, desperate ways all the time, but in the slow, steady rhythm of having just enough, and then, not quite enough. The changing of the seasons wasn't simply about weather or light, it was about survival. Let's step into that rhythm for a while. Imagine standing at the edge of a small village, the kind with maybe 20 or 30 cottages, their roofs low and uneven, their gardens small but precious. Beyond them stretch the fields, brown and sleeping in winter, green and whispering in summer. Every season in those fields carried its own taste, its own scent, and its own kind of hunger. In spring, everything begins again, but not in the hopeful way we think of now. Spring was often the hardest time of all. The old stores from winter had nearly vanished. The grain bins were low, the root cellars nearly empty, and the new crops were still small, fragile, and weeks away from being ready. They called it the hungry gap, that silent stretch between what had been eaten and what was still growing. Picture the household now. The bread is thinner, the stew is mostly water, even the animals are leaner. Cows give less milk because they too have little to eat. And yet somehow people endure. They find forgotten turnips in the soil. They scrape together barley. They chew on bitter herbs that sprout early in the meadows. In the poorest places, they boiled nettles and sorrel and called it soup. Still, there's beauty in that resilience. The world begins to wake, and you can almost feel hope hiding in the cold ground. When the first shoots of green appear, the village feels a tiny spark of relief. Someone might pluck wild garlic, someone else might find the first egg of the season. Children laugh again, because they can smell grass instead of frost. Even if their bellies still ache, the light itself seems to feed them. Then comes summer, a season of work. It was beautiful, yes, but brutally demanding. From dawn to dusk, the fields filled with people. Men cut hay, women bundled grain, children chased geese from the crops. The sun could bake the land dry, and there was no shade in a peasant's schedule. They ate in the fields, their meals. Simple: bread, cheese, ale, maybe a handful of onions. If it was a good year, there'd be enough to eat without fear. If not, they'd whisper quiet prayers to the sky, hoping the next rain wouldn't come too late. The medieval diet wasn't just shaped by class, it was sculpted by the weather. A dry summer could mean thin porridge by winter. A single bad harvest could ripple for years. That's why so many prayers, so many festivals, were tied to crops and rain. People didn't just depend on the land. They lived at its mercy. By August, the air would fill with the smell of wheat. That's when harvest began, the most sacred time of the year. The entire village became a single heartbeat, swinging scythes, carrying sheaves, sweating through long golden days. There was laughter then, despite the exhaustion, because if the harvest went well, everyone would live through the winter. If it didn't, well, no one said that out loud. You can almost hear the sound of it. The soft shar of grain brushing against skin, the scrape of sickles against stalks, the murmured songs of workers keeping rhythm together. They'd eat on the edge of the field, sitting in circles, hard bread dipped in ale, a few apples or leeks, sometimes a rare bit of salted meat, and though it was humble, it tasted like triumph. Then, as the days shortened, autumn crept in. The colours deepened, the air thickened with the smell of wood smoke and drying herbs. This was the time of preparation, when survival turned into craft. Families stored what they could: apples in straw, beans strung on cords to dry, herbs hung from rafters. They slaughtered animals they couldn't afford to keep through winter, preserved meat with salt, boiled bones for stock, and sealed jars with fat. It was messy, smelly, difficult work, but it was life insurance. In these moments, the medieval world felt alive in a different way. There was pride in the act of readiness, a kind of quiet wisdom passed down through generations. A woman stirring a pot of boiling fat, a man hanging sausages from the rafters, a child counting apples. They were writing their safety into the months ahead. And then, winter came. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic. It was dark, silent and long. The snow didn't fall like a postcard. It came like a curtain, cutting the world off from itself. Fires burned low to save wood, and breath hung in the air inside the house. Every sound felt muffled: the crack of the hearth, the distant howl of wind. Hunger returned, not sharp and sudden, but slow and patient, like a visitor that wouldn't leave. Meals grew smaller, the bread was coarser. People stretched their stores with cleverness. A handful of beans here, a bit of broth thickened with flour there. They used ashes in cooking sometimes, not for taste, but because it helped preserve the little fat they had. Roots grew wrinkled and soft, grain grew stale, and still, people endured. There's a haunting rhythm to that endurance, to knowing that no matter how carefully you planned, the dark months would still test you. And yet, even then, there were sparks of joy. On Christmas or the feast of St. Martin, families might slaughter a pig and share the meat. Neighbours gathered, candles glowed, and for a single evening, The long hunger of the year felt far away. Let's take a quiet moment and imagine that glow, a crowded cottage, laughter echoing off the walls, children half asleep near the fire, their faces smeared with grease from roasted meat. For them, that night was magic. For the parents, it was relief. They'd made it through another turn of the earth. But soon after, the feasting was done, and the waiting began again. Because every medieval year was a wheel turning from want to plenty, and back to want again. The poor didn't measure time in minutes, but in harvests and shortages. They could tell the month by the taste of the stew. Too many beans? It must be March. Fresh bread with herbs. Then it's midsummer, and that's something that's easy to forget now. How deeply tied people were to the rhythm of the land. Food wasn't just eaten, it was felt. Every meal carried the weight of the season, the smell of the soil, the echo of rain or drought. They didn't read calendars, they read the earth. When the first thaw came again, you could hear it before you saw it. The crack of ice loosening from the roof, the drip of meltwater into the barrels, the soft sigh of mud beneath your feet. People smiled more easily then. There was light again, and the sound of birds. The hungry gap was coming, yes, but so was life. Sometimes I think about what that must have done to the spirit. To live every year in that constant dance between feast and famine, between comfort and fear. Maybe that's why gratitude was so strong then, why blessings were whispered even over a bowl of watery soup. When you live so close to the edge, you learn that every mouthful is a miracle. And though centuries have passed, there's something about that rhythm that lingers in us still. The way a warm loaf smells in winter, the way spring feels like a deep breath after a long silence. It's the echo of the old hunger, quiet now, but not gone. Somewhere in that endless turning of the seasons, humanity learned patience. We learned how to endure, how to plan, how to hope. And though the fields have changed, the lessons remain, woven into every loaf, every seed, every sip of warm broth. So, as the snow settles once more over that small village, and the smoke rises slowly from the chimneys, you can almost hear it, the whisper of the year itself, turning again, bringing hunger and harvest, fear and gratitude, all in their time. And in that rhythm, that fragile, unending rhythm, the Middle Ages found its heartbeat. If you had to choose one dish that defined the Middle Ages, not for kings or monks, but for ordinary people, it wouldn't be roasted meat or bread or even ale. It would be something humbler, something that simmered quietly in every cottage, that stretched scraps into sustenance, and that could feed a family on almost nothing. It would be pottage, thick, greyish, ever-changing, the stew that never truly ended, a pot of patience really, and beside it, its close cousin porridge. Grains boiled into something you could chew, something that warmed the bones on a cold morning. The two were almost inseparable from medieval life, as ordinary as breathing, as necessary as hope. Let's imagine a pot of pottage now, swinging gently over a fire that's been burning since dawn. The cottage is dim and smoky, its walls stained black from years of cooking. A woman leans over the hearth, her eyes red from the smoke. She stirs slowly with a wooden ladle, the rhythm as old as the land itself. Inside that pot is not a recipe, it's a reflection of the week. Maybe a few carrots, a piece of cabbage, a strip of bacon if they're lucky, maybe peas soaked overnight, or beans softened by boiling for hours. No two pots of pottage were ever the same. They were living things always changing, never truly finished. That's because pottage wasn't a meal cooked once and eaten. It was a pot that stayed on the fire, sometimes for days, even weeks. Each morning, a bit more water added. Each evening, another handful of whatever was found. Yesterday's stew became today's breakfast, and tomorrow's dinner. The pot itself held history. Layers of flavour and stories of scarcity. For people with little, this was the art of survival, stretching the last onion, saving the last piece of fat, learning how to make warmth taste like food. There was genius in that simplicity. They didn't have recipes, they had instincts. A handful of herbs could brighten the whole pot. A spoon of vinegar could make it feel new again. Cooking, for the poor, was not about luxury, it was about endurance and care. Let's take a closer look at what went into that pot. Most often, grains formed the base: barley, oats, rye, or sometimes spelt. Barley was especially beloved because it grew easily, even in poor soil. Peas and beans were staples too, the medieval version of protein. Then came vegetables, whatever was seasonal: leeks, onions, garlic, cabbage, turnips, carrots. Potatoes didn't exist yet in Europe, nor tomatoes, nor corn. Those would arrive centuries later, so flavour came from herbs, and from the slow magic of time. Imagine that smell, a faint sweetness from the carrots, the sharp bite of onion, the warm scent of earth from the turnips. If a bit of pork or mutton made its way in, it transformed everything. Even a single bone could turn plain pottage into something almost festive. The fat that rose to the top was precious. It was scooped off and saved for bread, or smeared on hard crusts to soften them. Sometimes the pottage was thin, more soup than stew. Other times it was thick enough to stand a spoon upright in. The texture depended not on taste but on luck. If there was grain to spare, it would be hearty. If there wasn't, water and hope filled the gaps. Still, even the thinnest pottage carried comfort. It was warm. It filled the stomach. It gave the illusion, at least, of enough. Porridge, meanwhile, was its morning twin. Where pottage was savoury and stretched, porridge was quick, a simple boiling of oats or barley in water or milk. It was eaten hot, often with a pinch of salt, sometimes with a drizzle of honey, more often with nothing at all. For many, it was the first and last thing they tasted each day. Children grew up on porridge. Old people softened their bread in it, and travellers carried dried grains so they could make porridge anywhere there was water and fire. It was cheap, filling, and reliable. A quiet miracle in a harsh world. If you were lucky enough to visit a medieval village at dawn, you'd hear the faint, bubbling sound of both dishes being made, the soft plop of grain hitting hot water, the occasional hiss as the pot shifted on the hook. And beneath it all, the sound of breathing, steady, human, ancient. Meals like these shaped the pace of the day. There was no rush, no instant hunger to satisfy. You ate when the work allowed, and you worked because the food demanded it. A bowl of pottage in the morning could last until evening, not because it was heavy, but because people's expectations were small. You didn't eat to feel full. You ate to keep going. There's a strange sort of wisdom in that. Today we think of patience as a virtue, but back then it was survival. Food took time to grow, to cook, to eat. Even the act of stirring the pot was an act of devotion. Too fast and you'd scorch the bottom. Too slow and the flavours wouldn't blend. So you learnt to listen to the bubbling, to the fire, to the quiet language of necessity. And it wasn't just the poor who ate pottage. Everyone did, in one form or another. In monasteries, the brothers ate it during fasting seasons, sometimes with lentils or herbs. In castles, it appeared as soup, enriched with spices and chunks of meat, served in fine bowls instead of wooden ones. The rich had more ingredients, but the principle was the same. Boil, season, serve, repeat. It was the common ground between every table in Europe. Still, the flavour of poverty lingered. For the poor, pottage was not just food, it was identity. A pot left simmering was a symbol of care, a sign that the home still had life. If a traveller passed by and saw smoke rising from a cottage, they knew, someone is still here, someone still endures. And that's what makes this dish so haunting. It's not delicious, it's not romantic, but it carries the taste of endurance, the quiet defiance of people who refused to starve. Sometimes, there were additions that told little stories. A handful of nettles in spring meant the garden hadn't yet given enough. A slice of turnip in winter meant someone had kept a root cellar well. If the pottage had peas, the year had been kind. If it was just grain and water, then the family was walking the edge of hunger. The pot was a diary without words, a daily entry written in flavour, and yet somehow these same meals could bring joy. A mother would taste the stew and smile faintly, remembering that it was thicker than last week. A father would break his bread and dip it in slowly, letting the warmth spread through his fingers. Children would lick their spoons and scrape the sides of the pot for the last bits. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Even the tools carried stories. Wooden ladles passed from mother to daughter, clay pots repaired with bits of metal wire, wooden bowls worn smooth by generations of spoons. Every scratch on them marked another winter survived. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was memory in motion. If you looked closely, you'd see that every village had its own flavour of pottage. Near the coast, they might add fish or seaweed. In the forests, mushrooms and herbs. In highlands, more oats, more roots. Each region learned to listen to its land, to let the earth decide the taste. And so, even the simplest stew became a reflection of place, of soil, weather, patience and hope. It's easy to romanticize that now, but life around that pot was hard. Hunger never went far. Even a small accident, a storm, a poor harvest, an illness, could empty the bowl. But as long as there was a pot, a fire, and something to stir, there was a chance. Let's linger in that kitchen for a moment longer. The fire crackles softly. The woman stirring the pot hums a tune, something old, something wordless. A child sits near her feet, playing with a bit of straw. The smell of the stew fills the air, a mix of salt, smoke, and earth. It's not much, but it feels alive. And when the family gathers to eat, there's a kind of peace in it, a silence that isn't empty but full. You can almost taste it, can't you? That slow, humble warmth of a meal born from patience. It's not about the flavour, it's about the meaning, the act of caring enough to keep stirring. And that's why, for centuries, pottage stayed on the fire. Because it wasn't just food, it was faith. Faith that tomorrow there would still be something left to add. If you strip the Middle Ages of its noise, its clashing swords, its saints and sinners, its kings and cathedrals, what remains is the quiet heartbeat of something far humbler: grain, wheat, barley, rye, oats, the unglamorous seeds that built a civilization one crust at a time. Grain was not simply food, it was life itself. It was the calendar, the economy, the faith, the comfort, and the fear. And though centuries have softened its image, the story of grain in the medieval world is one of endurance, sweat, and reverence. Let's begin in the fields, before dawn. The air is cold, damp with dew, and the earth smells like iron and root. You can see the dark silhouettes of men and women moving slowly, their breath misting, their hands gripping wooden handles polished smooth by generations. The sound is rhythmic, the swish of scythes, the rustle of stalks falling in waves. Each cut of the blade is a small prayer. Because every handful harvested means survival through the coming winter. The humble grain was the truest clock of the Middle Ages. When it grew well, there was laughter in the village. When it failed, the church bells tolled more often. Barley was the workhorse of the poor. It grew in places too harsh for wheat, and it didn't mind the cold or the thin soil of the northern hills. Its flavour was rough, its texture heavy, but it filled the stomach. The peasants baked it into dense loaves that could last for weeks. Loaves that had to be sawed rather than sliced, so hard they sometimes dulled knives. Yet even that bread had dignity. It was the bread of the honest, of people who asked only that it not mould before the next harvest. Rye, too, fed millions. It was darker, almost grey when baked, and had a tang that spoke of sour air and wet earth. When you imagine the typical medieval bread, it's rye, you're tasting the bitter kind, made with whatever yeast happened to wander into the dough. A good baker guarded that yeast like treasure. He might even speak to it, as if it were a living creature that decided whether the village ate or starved. Wheat, however, was a dream. It grew best in rich soil and warm sun, conditions that peasants rarely owned. When they saw wheat fields, they often saw them from the road, belonging to a monastery or a lord's estate. Its golden colour was almost painful to look at, a reminder that even the colour of bread could mark class. White loaves for the wealthy, dark loaves for the rest. To eat wheat was to taste privilege. Still, the poor found their ways. They mixed grains, creating maslin, a blend of wheat and rye, sometimes barley or oats thrown in for good measure. The result was unpredictable but nourishing. Maslin was democracy in a loaf, imperfect, uneven, but enough to keep a body alive. And in that unevenness lay the whole spirit of the age. You can imagine the rhythm of life around these grains. Sowing in autumn, praying through winter, watching the first green shoots in spring with cautious hope. Every stage was labour. Men ploughed with oxen through stubborn soil. Women followed behind, scattering seed from worn aprons. Children chased birds away, their laughter echoing over the fields. The land itself was alive with movement, a choreography of hunger and faith. Then came harvest, the season of urgency. No one slept much then. The fields turned gold, and time became precious. A single rainstorm could ruin the crop. So entire villages turned into armies of labourers. Even priests and merchants joined the reaping. The sound of sickles filled the air like music. Sweat mixed with dust, and for a few weeks every hour mattered. They cut, bundled, stacked, and prayed. By dusk the ground would glitter with fallen chaff, and the smell of crushed grain would cling to their clothes. After the harvest came the threshing, a slower, more deliberate ritual. Grain was beaten from stalks with flails, the air filled with the dry, papery scent of husks. Children leapt into the piles, laughing, their hair coated in dust. Then came winnowing, tossing grain into the wind, letting the chaff blow away while the heavier seeds fell to earth. It looked almost holy, a dance of dust and sunlight, and in a way it was, because these were the seeds that would carry life through the dark months ahead. But grain was never entirely safe. Rats loved it. Mold spoiled it. Thieves coveted it. So the villagers built granaries, small wooden buildings raised off the ground, their walls lined with straw to keep out moisture. Sometimes the church kept a portion of the grain, not just as tax but as a kind of community insurance. If a family starved, the church might lend them a sack to be repaid after the next harvest. Even mercy was measured in handfuls of grain. Still, even the best grain could turn against you. Rye, in particular, carried a dark secret: ergot, a fungus that could poison an entire village. When it infected the crop, the bread baked from it brought madness. People would tremble, hallucinate, their fingers blackening as if burned. It was called St. Anthony's fire. Some thought it divine punishment. In truth, it was biology, long before biology had a name. And yet, they kept eating. What choice did they have? Better a chance of madness than the certainty of hunger. Grain shaped everything, not just diet but belief. It was the reason for festivals, the core of tithes, the foundation of community. Bread wasn't only food, it was sacred. In church, the priest lifted the host, a small round wafer of wheat, and declared it the body of Christ. For a peasant who rarely touched wheat otherwise, well, that was profound. It meant holiness was edible, that salvation had a taste, and it was white, soft, and unreachable. In the markets, grain was money. A sack could pay rent, settle debts, even buy forgiveness from a local lord. A bad harvest could mean not just hunger but ruin. Families sold tools, livestock, or even themselves into service just to keep bread on the table. In the ledgers of the time, debt was measured in bushels. To owe grain was to owe life. Still, for all its hardship, there was a strange poetry in it. Because grain asked for faith, not in gods, but in seasons. You buried it in darkness and waited, trusting that it would rise again in light. That cycle mirrored everything people believed. Death and resurrection, winter and spring, despair and renewal. Every loaf was a sermon in disguise. Let's wander back to a small cottage. Inside, a woman kneels beside a wooden trough. Mixing barley flour with warm water, she adds salt, stirs with her hands, and the dough clings to her fingers like a living thing. She shapes it into a flat loaf and sets it near the fire to bake. The smell fills the room, smoky, rough, comforting in its simplicity. Her children sit waiting, not talking. When the loaf is ready, she breaks it into pieces, handing each child a share. They chew slowly, reverently. It's not soft, it's not sweet, but it's enough. That scene repeated itself millions of times. From Scotland to Sicily, bread was the common language of survival. It connected everyone, rich and poor, believer and skeptic. And because of that, it became something spiritual, a symbol of home, of labour, of gratitude. Yet, not all grains were humble. Oats, for instance, carried a strange reputation. In England, people joked that oats were horse food. In Scotland, though, they were life itself. A Scottish peasant might look at his English neighbour's wheat bread and shrug. Let them eat their pride. Because oats grew where nothing else would, feeding not just people but animals through brutal winters. That small, pale grain kept whole nations breathing. Grain even governed time. The medieval year revolved around sowing and harvest. Feast days marked the turning points. Lammas in August, Michaelmas in September, Candlemas in February, when the last of the stored grain was counted. The church bells didn't just tell time, they told hunger. And when a new loaf came from the first grain of the season, people crossed themselves before tasting it. They called it the loaf mass, the blessing of bread, a quiet gratitude that the earth had once again forgiven them. But let's not romanticize it too much. Grain was also labour, relentless and exhausting. From dawn to dusk, bodies bent under sacks, hands blistered, backs broke. Threshing floors echoed with the thud of flails. Dust filled lungs. For every loaf baked, someone's body paid the price. The humble grain demanded worship through work. Still, there was love in that labour, because without it, there was nothing. And so people sang as they worked, soft, repetitive songs that kept rhythm with the flails. Sometimes, the whole village joined in, their voices rising and falling like the wind through stalks. In those moments, hunger and hardship blurred into harmony. Centuries later, those songs still echo faintly in old ballads. Songs of sowing, of baking, of sharing, simple songs about loaves and labour, about the miracle of something so small feeding so many. As the day ends in our little imagined village, the fields lie bare again, stubble catching the last light. The granaries are locked, the oxen resting, smoke rises from chimneys, and the smell of baking drifts through the air. Earthy, heavy, real. It's the scent of effort rewarded, of patience turned to nourishment. You can almost hear the sighs of relief. Another harvest done, another winter survived. The grain sleeps now, safe in sacks and hearts, waiting for its next season. In its quiet way, the humble grain ruled the Middle Ages more completely than any king, because no crown, no sword, no sermon could fill an empty stomach. Only the earth could do that, grain by grain, loaf by loaf, year by year, and so, long before history called it progress, the people of those centuries understood something simple and profound. That greatness begins not with power, but with patience, and with the steady, unglamorous work of growing food for another day. Step outside that little cottage for a moment, into the heart of a medieval village. The morning air tastes faintly of wood smoke, wet straw, and distant bread. It is not the scent of luxury but of effort, of lives built from the soil upward. Every lane smells slightly different, a clue to what people are cooking, brewing, or drying behind crooked doors. If you close your eyes, you could almost navigate by smell alone. Here, on the edge of the square, someone is crushing garlic with a stone, its sharpness cutting through the damp. A few houses away, leeks sizzle gently in a pan of animal fat. The aroma of onions, sweet, earthy, comforting, clings to every sleeve in the village. And somewhere, far off, a whiff of ale drifts from the brewer's hut, that yeasty, bubbling perfume of patience. This is the true flavour of the Middle Ages, humble, local, endlessly repeating, yet never dull to those who lived it. People often imagine medieval food as tasteless, but the poor knew flavour deeply. They had to. When meat was rare and salt expensive, every leaf, every bulb, every root mattered. They coaxed flavour from what the earth offered, not to impress, but to endure. Taste was survival's reward. Garlic, onions, and leeks were the trinity of the peasant kitchen. They grew easily, stored well, and transformed whatever they touched. A bowl of thin barley broth could become rich with a single clove of garlic. Leeks gave colour and perfume to pottage. Onions were fried until golden and stirred into almost everything. It wasn't refinement, it was instinct, the kind born of repetition and necessity. Herbs added their quiet magic. The cottage gardens behind every house were small, fenced with woven sticks, but they were dense with meaning. There grew parsley, sage, thyme, dill, mint, fennel, maybe a few stalks of chive. In summer, women gathered them in bunches, hung them from the rafters, and let them dry slowly in the smoky air. Come winter, a pinch of those crumbled leaves could remind the tongue of sunlight. Salt was harder to come by. Inland villages treated it as treasure. A handful might cost a day's labour, sometimes more. When trade routes failed, people scraped salt from evaporated brine or even burned certain plants and used the ashes for a bitter substitute. Without salt, food dulled, so people learned to make sourness and herbs do the work instead. They discovered that vinegar, ale, or fermented cabbage could awaken the tongue just as well. That taste, sharp, smoky, herbal, became the flavour of daily life. Even today, if you fry leeks in butter and inhale, you breathe the same air they did. Let's walk farther down the lane. A woman stands beside a wooden tub, her sleeves rolled high, turning curds in a cloth. Cheese is forming, coarse, sour, alive. The smell is heavy, the texture rough. Poor cheese was not aged or shaped with elegance. It was survival in solid form. Goat milk in the mountains, cow milk in the valleys, sheep milk where neither thrived. Every village had its own version, its own pride. They didn't speak of recipes, they spoke of ways. This is the way we make it, they would say, and the sentence was older than memory. Next to her, a small pot bubbles with something sweetish. It might be honey, the only sugar most peasants ever knew. Beekeeping was common, but honey was precious, stored in clay jars for special days. The children licked the lids clean. Honey turned bitter ale into something festive, soothed sore throats, preserved fruit. It was gold in liquid form. The fruits themselves were modest. Apples, pears, plums, sometimes cherries if the season was kind. They were eaten fresh at harvest, dried on racks above the hearth, or stewed into thick pastes that kept for months. In the dead of winter, that sweetness could bring tears. Imagine the joy of tasting an apple in February, a small miracle, proof that the sun would return. And then there were roots, carrots, parsnips, Turnips, beets, the backbone of the medieval palate. Their sweetness came not from sugar but from patience. Slow boiling, long simmering, gentle roasting in ashes. When meat was absent, these roots pretended to be it. Turnips took the role of flesh. Parsnips mimicked fat. Onions gave the illusion of richness. It was the theatre of flavour, performed nightly in every cottage. Not everything grew willingly. In poorer soils, people foraged. Mushrooms, sorrel, nettles, wild garlic, berries, hazelnuts. Foraging was half knowledge, half faith. Pick the wrong mushroom, and supper became funeral. But get it right, and you added colour to grey months. Children learned early which leaves to gather. They came home with baskets of greens, proud as hunters. Their laughter was part of dinner. Season by season, the taste of the village shifted. Spring was sour and green, nettles, young onions, herbs, eggs. Summer turned soft and fragrant, peas, fresh beans, milk, fruit. Autumn was earthy, smoky, full grain, roots, ale, meat from slaughter. Winter, our winter tasted of smoke and salt, of patience and memory. Each month had a flavour, each flavour a story. We rarely think of water as taste, but the villagers did. Wells gave each home its signature. Some were sweet, some bitter, some metallic. That taste carried into every soup, every beer, every loaf. When people visited another village, they noticed the difference immediately. Your bread tastes like your water, they'd say. And it wasn't insult, it was recognition. Ale was another layer of daily flavour, a low, yeasty hum beneath everything else. Women brewed it in most homes. Brewing was considered domestic work, not craft. The result was mild and cloudy, only slightly alcoholic. Children drank it safely. The flavour depended on the grain, the herbs, even the wood of the stirring stick. No two ales ever tasted alike. Some had a hint of honey, some bitterness from yarrow or heather. It was the village's heartbeat in liquid form. Once in a while someone would experiment, adding crushed berries or bits of dried apple to the brew. They weren't chasing invention, they were chasing comfort. In a world ruled by repetition, taste was freedom. Let's linger by the communal oven at the edge of the square. The smell of baking is intoxicating, that deep, almost holy aroma of browning crust and smoke. Families come carrying their dough in baskets, each loaf marked with a small sign, a cross, a circle, a line, their personal signature. The baker feeds the fire, wipes sweat from his face, nods to each neighbour. He is part artisan, part priest, part magician. When he pulls the loaves out, steam rushes into the cold air and everyone inhales at once. For a moment, hunger turns to gratitude. The loaves are not soft, they are dense, crackling, alive with heat. Each family carries theirs home like treasure. The taste of that bread, coarse, smoky, faintly sour, was the taste of the village itself. Every crumb held a map of its soil, its water, its patience. To outsiders it might seem monotonous. To those who lived it, it was identity. There was laughter too, sometimes. A neighbour burning his loaf became a joke for weeks. Children stealing bits of dough earned mock scoldings. Even in poverty there was flavour in humour. People seasoned their hardship with stories. That was another kind of spice, invisible but necessary. Animals added their subtle notes as well. The smell of sheep near the green, of pigs rooting near the fence, of cows giving milk in the early fog. These were not unpleasant odours to medieval noses. They were part of the bouquet of daily life. Food did not come wrapped or hidden. It bleated, clucked, oinked, mooed. And when it became dinner, people remembered its voice. Gratitude and necessity lived side by side at the same table. At festivals, the taste of the village blossomed. Ale grew stronger. Honey flowed freely. Spices appeared, rare, dazzling. Cinnamon, pepper, saffron, tiny pinches brought by merchants, sprinkled sparingly like blessings. For one day, everyone tasted what the rich tasted always. And for one day the village believed that life could be generous. But ordinary days had their own quiet luxury. The first spoonful of warm broth, after a cold morning in the fields. The first ripe plum stolen from a tree. The crunch of a roasted onion skin. Small, unrecorded pleasures that never reached chronicles, yet built the real memory of the Middle Ages. By evening, the flavours mellow. Smoke thickens in the lanes. The last light of the sun turns the thatch golden. Families gather around their fires, bowls in hand. The air is heavy with the perfume of herbs and ash. Somewhere a dog whines for a scrap. Someone hums an old song. You can almost taste the music, a mix of longing and peace. It's tempting to call their food poor, but perhaps it was richer than ours in another sense. It demanded attention, gratitude, patience. Every flavour was earned, every meal remembered where it came from, and maybe that's why the taste of the village lingers in imagination, because it wasn't about variety, it was about connection. When you bite into bread today, you're tasting the echo of their labour. When you smell garlic hitting hot oil, you breathe the same hope they felt. That simple things, done with care, could make life bearable. As night falls over the village, the wind carries one last wave of scent, smoke, herbs, warm grain. Doors close, fires dim, silence settles. Inside, the last crumbs are eaten, and someone whispers thanks into the dark. The taste of the village fades for now, but it never truly leaves. It lives in every humble meal that follows, in every kitchen that still believes flavour can come from almost nothing. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you could measure time not only by the seasons, but by what you were allowed to eat. The calendar itself was divided by hunger and holiness, and nowhere was this more visible, or more edible, than in the endless rhythm of fasts and feasts that shaped every mouthful of the medieval year. The church ruled the stomach as firmly as it ruled the soul. There were over 150 fasting days in a typical year. That meant nearly half the time, meat was forbidden. No pork, no beef, no poultry, no eggs, no animal fat. But there was a curious loophole: fish. Fish, being creatures of the water, were exempt from the laws of flesh. And so, out of theology, grew one of the most distinctive flavours of the Middle Ages, the taste of fish. Salted, smoked, dried, pickled or fresh, depending on where you lived and how far you were from the sea. Let's imagine one of those days now. It's early morning in a small village somewhere inland. The church bell tolls, reminding everyone it's Friday, a fasting day. The air smells of smoke and wet earth, and in the distance, someone is stirring ashes to rekindle a cooking fire. Inside a cottage, a woman unwraps a small cloth bundle. Inside lies a strip of salted herring, grey, stiff, glistening faintly with oil. It's the family's only fish this week. She soaks it in a bowl of water, softening it, while her children watch in silence. For them, the promise of salt and fat is enough to make the day feel like a feast. In richer homes, fasting days could still be lavish. The upper classes had access to ponds stocked with carp and trout. Monasteries, too, became masters of fish farming. Ingenious networks of artificial ponds filled with eels, tench and pike. They learned the art of abundance within restriction. If God said no meat, the monks simply multiplied the fish. Some abbeys had so many ponds that travellers joked you could walk from one end of the monastery to the other without ever stepping on dry land. In the coastal towns, the story was different again. The air there was thick with the smell of brine, tar and drying nets. Boats creaked against wooden docks. Men shouted, gulls screamed, and salt blew through every street. Fresh fish was cheap there. Cod, herring, mackerel, whiting. But it had to move fast. Without ice, without modern preservation, time was the true enemy. So they salted it, packed it in barrels, and sent it inland along muddy roads. By the time it reached the villages, it was tough, pungent and pale. Yet for the people who received it, it tasted like the sea, and that was miracle enough. The trade in fish shaped Europe's economy more than most wars did. The North Sea became a vast pantry, its waters fished year-round. Herring was king, small, oily, and endlessly numerous. Salted herring was shipped to Germany, to France, to the Baltic, to the Mediterranean. Some towns owed their existence entirely to that trade. The Hanseatic League, those powerful northern merchants, built empires on barrels of fish. Every one of those barrels was a small act of devotion, proof that faith and hunger could work together. Of course, the poor rarely saw the good stuff. By the time fish reached inland villages, it was often so dry or salty that it had to be boiled for hours before it could be eaten. The broth left behind, murky, metallic, briny, was sometimes drunk as soup. They'd crumble bread into it, add a leek or two, and call it dinner. It sounds bleak, but for them, that taste of the sea, however faint, was something sacred. It was a flavour that linked them to distant places they'd never see. Let's step into a monastery kitchen for a moment. The room is cool, shadowed, the air filled with the smell of wet stone and herbs. A monk in a brown robe tends to a row of earthenware pots. He stirs slowly, methodically, humming a psalm under his breath. Inside the pot, fish stew thickened with almonds and parsley. The scent of vinegar rises from another pot, perhaps a sweet and sour sauce made from wine and dried fruit. Even in fasting there was art. The monks believed that cooking well honoured creation, and so their tables, though meatless, were rich in imagination. In coastal monasteries, especially in England and Normandy, fish dishes reached near gourmet levels. They layered flavours with mustard, ginger and saffron, rare spices brought by merchants from the east. To eat there on a fast day was to forget you were fasting at all. The poor, meanwhile, chewed their leathery herring in silence and prayed that God would understand their gratitude. But fasting wasn't only about rules, it was about rhythm. It gave life a pattern, a rise and fall between denial and reward. After weeks of lean meals came the feasts: Easter, Christmas, Pentecost. On those days meat returned like a long-lost friend. People roasted whole pigs, slaughtered geese, boiled sausages in cauldrons. The smell of fat and smoke filled the air, and laughter rose with it. They ate until they couldn't move, partly out of joy, partly out of fear that soon they'd have to give it up again. Fish and faith became so entwined that even language changed. Friday, the day of fasting, became Fish Day. Market records show special prices for fish sold on Thursdays because everyone knew what was coming. In paintings and carvings, Christ himself is often depicted with a fish. The symbol of Christianity, that simple curved line forming a fish, came to stand not only for belief, but for sustenance, for shared meals, for quiet endurance. There's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? The same creature that filled bellies also filled sermons. Every meal was a small moral lesson: discipline, gratitude, humility. The rich might eat out of silver, the poor from wooden bowls, but the same rule guided them both: to restrain appetite, to remember the soul. Still, people found loopholes. Human cleverness has never been patient with hunger. When the church forbade meat from animals that walked on land, someone promptly declared that ducks and geese, being swimmers, counted as fish. And so monasteries fattened geese by the pond, feasting legally on waterfowl while maintaining pious expressions. Even beavers, yes, beavers were classified as fish because they had tails like one. Some regions even ate otters and puffins under the same reasoning. Faith, it seemed, had a flexible palate. In the homes of the poor, there was less room for such theological gymnastics. If you couldn't afford meat, then fasting was simply life. Every day looked like Lent. And so, the moral meaning of fasting blurred. For them, abstinence wasn't choice but condition. Perhaps that's why medieval sermons often reminded the rich that true virtue wasn't just giving up meat, but giving it to those who never had it in the first place. There's a story from a 14th century French village about a widow who shared her last salted fish with a hungry traveller on a fasting day. That night, they said, her empty barrel was miraculously full again. Whether you believe it or not, the story captures something real: the belief that generosity multiplied itself. That in a world where food was holy, sharing was salvation. Let's walk back toward the coast now, to a small fishing hamlet where the sea meets rock and fog. The beach is littered with boats pulled up on the shingle. Nets spread out like spider webs to dry. Men in rough woolen tunics mend the lines with numb fingers. Children gather driftwood for the fire. The smell of fish, sharp, living, inevitable, hangs heavy in the air. A woman tends a smoking rack, strips of herring glistening in the grey light. For her, this isn't work, it's ritual. Every piece of fish she smokes might buy bread, candles or cloth. Her hands are the link between ocean and land, between hunger and hope. At sunset, when the tide withdraws, she sits by the fire and eats a small piece herself. The skin crackles, the salt burns her tongue, but her eyes soften. It tastes of labour and prayer. It tastes like life continuing. The rhythm of fish and faith continued for centuries. Even after the Reformation, even after kings rose and fell, Fridays still smelled faintly of salt and smoke. The custom endured long after the reason faded. And maybe that's because it spoke to something deeper, a recognition that food in all its forms binds body and spirit together. If you ever walk by the sea at dawn and catch that scent of salt and wood smoke, you're breathing history. You're smelling centuries of prayers, fasts and dinners. You're standing in the same breeze that carried the promise of fish to those who lived and died by it. And perhaps, in that quiet, you can feel what they felt. The strange peace of eating with gratitude. The awareness that even a small piece of salted fish can taste like faith. For most of the medieval year, food was routine, predictable, and spare. Bowls of pottage, bread hard as memory, ale as thin as patience. But every so often, the ordinary rhythm broke. A church bell rang for a saint's day, a wedding echoed through the fields, a good harvest arrived, or a noble decided to be generous. Then, just for a while, the village transformed. The air thickened with music, The smell of roasting fat rolled through the lanes, and even the poorest hearts lifted. These were the rare feasts, small windows when the Middle Ages remembered joy through the language of food. Imagine the approach of such a day. It begins quietly, like the soft breath before a song. Women sweep their doorways, repair torn aprons, and polish wooden bowls until they gleam. Men slaughter animals they have fattened for months. A goose, a pig, maybe a calf if fortune smiled. Children run from house to house, whispering, "They're baking!" Smoke rises from every chimney, thicker than usual, richer, fragrant with things the year seldom offered. In the centre of the village, a table is built from planks balanced on barrels. It will become the altar of celebration. By noon, baskets arrive, coarse bread, wheels of cheese, jugs of ale, pies filled with meat and herbs. There is laughter again. Someone tunes a fiddle, someone else calls for silence and prayer, and suddenly the square becomes the beating heart of the world. The Middle Ages did not feast lightly. Each one carried meaning. Thanksgiving, penance, hope. After months of fasting or working, the body longed for abundance, the way parched soil longs for rain. And when abundance came, people didn't nibble, they surrendered. They ate until the candlelight blurred, and the air trembled with singing. If hunger shaped humility, feasting restored humanity. Let's walk through one such day. It's midsummer, the feast of St. John, when the longest light of the year feels eternal. The villagers have finished the haymaking. They owe their thanks to heaven, and to one another. At dawn, the first fires are lit outside every house. Soon the village smells of wood and sweetness, a mix of sap, smoke, and roasting grain. Young men carry logs to the common green and build a towering bonfire that will burn through the night. It is both celebration and prayer, a symbol of light, warmth, and protection against whatever darkness follows. While the men labor, the women prepare the meal. The first sound is the crackle of fat in iron pans. Strips of pork hiss and curl, onions tumble in after them. The scent is almost sinful to people used to thin broth. They laugh nervously, aware that pleasure itself feels dangerous. Someone teases, "Eat now before the priest sees." Someone else replies, "The priest will be first in line." It's that kind of day where even holiness loosens its belt. At the baker's oven, loaves multiply. Some are plain, others are rich, kneaded with milk or honey. Children line up for the crusts, giggling when steam hits their faces. Down by the stream, women wash herbs, parsley, mint, dill, chives. They toss them into bowls with vinegar and salt, creating bright relishes to cut the heaviness of meat. Every sound, the chopping, the singing, the bubbling pots, becomes part of the feast's music. By afternoon, the first platters arrive at the long table. A roasted pig, its skin crisp and shining like amber. Trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread, serve as plates. Cheese wheels are cracked open, their smell sharp and grassy. Someone pours ale until it foams over the rims of wooden mugs. The noise builds, laughter spilling into the air like sparks from the fire. The poorest eat beside the wealthiest. Rank dissolves under appetite. For one evening, everyone chews in rhythm. Fingers tear meat from bone, bread soaks up gravy, salt glitters on sweaty lips. And when the ale runs low, someone refills it from a shared jug, without counting or caution. It is a fleeting democracy born of hunger satisfied. Food at these feasts was never delicate. It was hearty, messy, joyful. Pies stuffed with minced meat and dried fruit, turnips roasted until sweet, beans mashed with herbs and bacon fat. If there was venison, it was seasoned with pepper and vinegar. If there was fish, it came swimming in wine. Even humble dishes grew theatrical. Whole birds were baked inside pies, released as surprises when the crust broke. A peasant might see that spectacle only once in a lifetime and speak of it until death. But feasting was not just about food, it was performance. Jugglers, minstrels, storytellers, and dancers appeared as if conjured. A young man might climb atop a barrel and recite a poem he barely remembered. Children raced in circles, old men clapped the rhythm. For a few golden hours the village forgot its aches and debts. Joy became communal property, and then there were weddings, the grandest feasts of all. Even the poorest families would save for months, sometimes years, for a single day of excess. Neighbours contributed bread, cheese, ale. Relatives loaned animals or spices. It was understood that when your time came, the village would do the same for you. Weddings were not private. They were the beating heart of community. Tables stretched from one end of the street to the other. There was dancing until the moon vanished. And the next morning, the leftovers, cold meat, broth thickened with bread, bones gnawed clean, became the new symbol of tomorrow's work. Feasts followed the agricultural calendar too. After harvest came Lammas, the loaf mass, when the first bread from the new grain was blessed in church. At Michaelmas in September, geese were roasted in gratitude for protection through the year. In December, Christmas swallowed the darkness whole. For 12 days, even the poorest tried to find some abundance. Those who had none went caroling door to door, receiving bits of food in exchange for song. A crust of pie, a mug of ale, these were gifts enough. Inside castles, feasting was another universe entirely. The great halls glittered with banners and torches. Tables groaned under swans, peacocks, boars' heads, almond milk puddings, and spiced wine. But even there, the ritual was deeply medieval. Each course served in procession, each dish both nourishment and display. Musicians played between courses, jesters tumbled, priests blessed. To eat richly was to declare power, yet the act was still wrapped in prayer. No meal began without grace, no plate was cleared without thanks. The contrast between that splendour and the village green was vast, yet both feasts carried the same heartbeat: relief, gratitude, release. Because the fear of scarcity never truly vanished. Even as they laughed, people knew hunger was waiting patiently outside the firelight. Perhaps that knowledge made joy sharper. Each bite was defiance, each swallow a vow to live. As the sun sets on our imagined village feast, the bonfire sends sparks into the purple sky. Faces glow, shadows dance. Someone begins a slow song about harvest and heaven. Others join, their voices rough but true. Children fall asleep on straw. Dogs gnaw the bones beneath the tables. The ale grows flat, but no one minds. They have eaten well, a phrase that, in those days, meant everything. Later, when only embers remain, the last villagers sit in silence, staring at the dying fire. They know tomorrow the fields will call again. They will wake before dawn, their bodies heavy with the memory of plenty. But for now, they rest in the glow of shared satisfaction. The warmth of the fire lingers on their faces, and in their bellies, a quiet echo of fullness hums like prayer. Feasts were rare because life demanded they be. If joy came too often, it would lose its meaning. Scarcity made celebration sacred, and perhaps that is the secret that modern abundance forgets, that happiness tastes sweetest when it is earned, when it is shared, when it is fleeting. Somewhere in the ashes, a spark still glows. The smoke rises slowly into the cool night, carrying with it the scent of roast and ale and laughter, and as it drifts toward the stars, you can almost believe that heaven smells faintly, just faintly, of a medieval feast. Long before coffee steamed in taverns or wine filled every cup, the Middle Ages quenched its thirst with simpler spirits. Not the burning kind of modern drink, but the quiet, cloudy, bubbling heart of everyday life. It was not a luxury nor a vice. It was water made safe, grain made liquid, labour made drinkable. In a world where wells could sicken and rivers ran foul with waste, ale was salvation in disguise. To be thirsty was to be human, to brew was to survive. Step into any medieval village and follow your nose. You'd smell it first. A yeasty warmth drifting through narrow lanes, richer than bread, sharp with malt. Somewhere behind a half-open door, a cauldron simmers. Steam rises like a ghost, carrying the scent of barley and hope. A woman bends over the vat, sleeves rolled, hair bound with cloth. Her hands red from stirring. This is not a tavern, it is her home. Brewing is women's work, as natural as kneading dough or tending the hearth. They called it alewife's art, though few saw it as art. A small batch each week, measured not in litres but in the rhythm of need. Grain soaked, boiled, strained, cooled, fermented. No hops yet, those would come centuries later. Flavour came from herbs, groot, a secret blend passed from mother to daughter, yarrow, rosemary, mugwort, heather, juniper. Each village had its signature, and every drink carried its gossip. Her ales, strong as a sermon, someone might say. His, water pretending to be brave. In that cloudy drink lay nutrition and comfort. Ale contained bread, in another form, carbohydrate, yeast, a hint of alcohol. Children drank it, workers carried it to fields, monks brewed it in silence. It was breakfast, lunch, and prayer, all at once. A man could live on ale and bread for weeks, and many did. The body grew soft with grain, the spirit stayed warm. Ale blurred hunger's edges without darkening the mind. It was gentle intoxication, enough to sing, not enough to sin. Let's listen for a moment. In the courtyard of an abbey, copper cauldrons hiss and clatter. Monks in brown habits move with practiced grace, measuring barley by the handful, stirring with wooden paddles taller than a man. They are brewing not for profit, but for charity. Pilgrims will arrive, weary and blistered, and a cup of ale will greet them before any prayer. In monastic life, brewing became devotion, clean water transformed by patience. The smell of malt filled cloisters the way incense filled chapels. For peasants, brewing was more intimate, almost domestic poetry. Each household kept a small wooden mash tun. Each family had its taste. You could tell a village by its ale the way you might know a region today by its wine. In the north, darker and thicker. In the south, lighter, more fragrant. Sometimes they flavoured it with honey for special days, calling it braggot. The sweetness was rare and thrilling. A cup of braggot at harvest was like sunlight trapped in foam. Cider joined the story where apples thrived. In Normandy, in the English West Country, in northern Spain, apples fell like blessings every autumn. People gathered them in baskets, crushed them in wooden presses, watched the juice run amber into barrels. Fermentation began without permission, wild yeast working its quiet alchemy. Weeks later, the first sip sparkled slightly, cool and tart. Cider was less bread-like than ale, but it carried the same faith that nature, left alone, could turn labour into joy. Picture a late summer afternoon, the harvest nearly done, the air heavy with straw. In the orchard, men and women stomp apples underfoot, laughing as the pulp squirts between their toes. Children chase wasps away with sticks. A dog sleeps beneath the press. When the work ends, they fill cups and drink together, juice still foaming, sweet with ferment. The taste bites clean and sharp, a promise of the cold months ahead. That was cider's gift, a sip of autumn bottled against winter. Not everyone could afford apples, of course. In grain country, ale reigned supreme. Taverns, the beating heart of social life, grew wherever roads met. Their signs swung on iron hooks. A boar, a crown, a star, a simple painted jug. Inside, straw covered the floor, candles guttered in wooden sconces. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and malt. People sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, sharing cups carved from horn or wood. They drank not to forget, but to belong. Conversation moved slowly, like the ale itself, thick, honest, unhurried. A tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was the village newspaper, court and confessional combined. Deals were struck over mugs, marriages arranged, debts forgiven, songs improvised. A man might enter alone and leave with a friend or an argument. Even the priest might appear, claiming to inspect morality, but staying for just a sip. The tavern's laughter leaked through its walls like heat. In an age of labour and silence, it was the one room where voices could rise freely, but ale also carried risk, without precise science. Fermentation was faith in a barrel. Sometimes a batch soured, sometimes it frothed itself to death. A careless brewer could sicken half a village, yet they brewed again, because the alternative, drinking water, was worse. Rivers collected the waste of animals and people alike. Wells turned stagnant in summer heat. Boiling killed danger, but required fuel few could spare. So they trusted barley and yeast to do the work of purification. And miraculously, it did. Ale shaped labour itself. Farmhands were paid partly in drink. Masons demanded daily ale as condition of work. It fueled the building of cathedrals and castles. Chroniclers complained that English soldiers drank more ale than they carried arrows. But perhaps that was their secret strength, a liquid courage not of fury, but of familiarity. A sip before dawn, another at noon, one at dusk, each a pause between hardships. Let's step inside a manor hall on a feast day. Golden torches flicker against stone. On long tables, flagons of ale stand beside wine. The lord raises his cup, foam dripping onto his sleeve. Below the dais, servants drink from buckets after the toasts are done. The same brew, the same warmth, uniting those who rarely shared anything. Ale ignored hierarchy for a few minutes at a time. Meanwhile, in poorer homes, ale was thinner, brewed more often, drunk faster. A woman might brew on Monday, sell by Thursday, start again on Friday. The yeast never slept, it simply moved from one pot to the next, generation to generation. When an alewife died, her daughter inherited the starter, a living legacy, bubbling quietly like memory itself. Sometimes these women grew prosperous, their names known across towns. They hung broom twigs above their doors to signal fresh brew. a rustic ancestor of the pub sign, customers came carrying jugs or leather flasks, paying in coins, grain or gossip. For many widows, brewing was survival. The one trade society allowed them. But success could turn dangerous. A woman who sold too much, laughed too loudly, or wielded authority risked whispers of witchcraft. A pot of boiling grain looked suspiciously like a cauldron. Herbs for flavour resembled spells. Many an alewife became a legend, half admired, half feared, for knowing how to turn water into something powerful. Ale also marked the boundaries of life. It was served at births, baptisms, weddings and funerals. Each occasion had its brew. For death, there was dirge ale, dark and strong, meant to numb both grief and guests. For weddings, bride ale, lighter, sweeter, from which the modern word bridal descends. The drink bound life ceremonies like thread through fabric. And then there was cider's quieter cousin, perry, made from pears, soft, perfumed, delicate. It ripened slowly and spoiled easily. Only careful hands could coax it into clarity. Monks prized it for its symbolism, patience rewarded, sweetness from discipline. In autumn cloisters you might find rows of earthen jars cooling in shadows, their contents humming gently as they turned to gold. Together, ale and cider painted the medieval landscape with flavour. They were not drunk for oblivion, but for balance. They steadied nerves before labour, soothed thirst afterward, replaced what the body spent. Even children were calmer with ale, not drunk, just warmed. And though sermons warned against excess, everyone knew moderation was flexible when the harvest was good. Travellers wrote that one could cross half of Europe without ever tasting plain water. Every inn offered ale, sometimes thin as broth, sometimes potent as confession. The first sip told you where you were. Salty in coastal towns, sweet inland, sour near the mountains. To taste ale was to taste geography. When night fell and work was done, people gathered around small fires, mugs in hand. The world slowed. Someone might hum an old ballad, another tell a tale. Children drifted to sleep to the murmur of voices, the soft clink of wood against wood. It was not drunkenness, it was community made liquid, the kind that steadied calloused hands and softened hard hearts. If you could travel back and drink their ale, you might find it strange, flat, warm, slightly sweet. But you'd also taste time itself. Grain from last year's field, water from this morning's well, yeast descended from generations. It would taste honest. And when you swallowed, you'd understand why they loved it so. Because it was more than drink. It was reassurance, proof that something good could grow even in rough soil. That warmth could be poured and shared. As for cider, it had its poetry too. When the barrel was first tapped, the foam fizzed like laughter. In winter it was heated with spices and served at feasts, steam rising into cold air, carrying cinnamon and cloves into rafters darkened by centuries. Men warmed their hands around the cups, women smiled behind them. Even the priest took a sip, murmuring, "God made apples, who are we to refuse?" And so the Middle Ages dreamed through its thirst, a gentle, steady dream of malt and orchard, of community and faith. Ale and cider were not escape, they were endurance, turned golden. Each drop told the same story, that life, though hard, could still taste good. When morning returned, hangovers were rare, the drinks were mild, the people accustomed. They woke early, stretched aching backs and went to the fields again, the memory of warmth still lingering on their tongues. The world, though harsh, felt manageable, smoothed by barley, brightened by apples, bound together by the simplest chemistry of all, grain, water, time and trust. And maybe that's why, centuries later, when we lift a glass of beer or cider, something ancient stirs. Not the flavour, but the feeling, the humble gratitude that drink once meant safety, that a shared cup could turn strangers into neighbours. That, in the end, thirst was not just for water, but for company, for comfort, for belonging. So, as the medieval sun sets behind the thatched roofs, and the alewife scrubs her pot for tomorrow's batch, and the monks whisper their last prayers by candlelight, the night hums softly with fermentation. Tiny bubbles rise in the darkness, each one a heartbeat of the old world, still alive, still breathing, were still quietly turning grain into grace. Winter in the Middle Ages was not a picture of white serenity. It was the long inhale between harvest and hope, the quiet season when the land slept and hunger woke. Every creak of the cottage roof, every sigh of wind across the fields reminded people how thin the line was between survival and surrender. To live through a medieval winter was not a guarantee. It was an achievement repeated each year, earned through planning, prayer, and the stubborn will to endure. Let's open the door to a January morning. The air bites hard, sharper than iron. Frost traces delicate veins across the window's animal bladder panes. The hearth glows faintly, a handful of embers trying their best to remember fire. Inside, a family huddles close, wrapped in wool and silence. There is no talk of comfort, only calculation. How much grain remains? How many roots have not yet gone soft? How many days until something green appears again in the soil? The hungry season began long before the last snow melted. By February, the dried beans clinked sparsely at the bottom of jars. The salted meat had shrunk, its edges white with fatigue. Even the rats, once bold, had grown cautious, for there was little left to steal. A single turnip could become a treasure, a few onions, a negotiation with fortune. Meals shrank to essentials, a thin pottage stretched with water, thickened with barley dust, crusts of bread toasted on sticks, dipped into broth until soft. Sometimes children gnawed the rinds of old cheese, scraping them clean with teeth too young for such work. The house smelled not of cooking, but of smoke and waiting. Hunger had its own scent, dry, acrid, patient. In wealthier homes the struggle softened, but never disappeared. Even a manor's larders echoed with anxiety. A cold winter could devour stores faster than pride could replenish them. Servants rationed carefully. Stewards counted barrels by candlelight. Meat hung from hooks like frozen shadows. Salt became the true master of the house, preserving what time tried to steal. Every grain sprinkled on flesh was a promise to see spring. The poor had fewer promises. They measured survival, not in months but in days. When bread ran out, they baked cakes of oats and ground peas. Their texture gritty, their flavour unkind. When even that failed, some chewed bark from trees, or boiled nettles, gathered from thawing ditches. Chroniclers wrote of villages where people shared one pot among 10 souls, each dipping a wooden spoon in turn. Eyes lowered, lips murmuring thanks for whatever warmth remained. Yet even then, kindness flickered. Neighbours shared quietly, especially with the old or the ill. A woman might leave a loaf by another's door before dawn, pretending the wind had done it. A monk might carry baskets of dried peas to cottages beyond the monastery wall. Generosity was the only wealth that multiplied when given. Outside, the landscape hardened into silence. Snow muffled everything. Footsteps, axes, even the barking of dogs. The fields lay buried, the rivers crusted over. Travel slowed to misery. Those who had to cross long distances tied straw around their feet to keep from freezing. Others stayed indoors for weeks. Their world reduced to a single room, a single flame. Time itself changed texture in winter. Days were short, indistinguishable. Nights stretched like centuries. People counted by candles, by prayers, by the groaning of timbers in the wind. Some believed ghosts wandered freely in the long darkness. Others thought angels passed near, carrying warmth unseen. Either way, the human voice grew softer, as if speech might disturb the delicate balance between endurance and despair. Still, there was ritual. Each evening, someone stirred the embers and murmured a blessing for the fire. Each morning, before stepping outside, they crossed themselves and whispered, "Let the cold bite the earth, not the heart." Faith, in winter, was not theology, it was temperature management for the soul. Animals suffered beside their owners. Cows gave less milk. Chickens ceased laying. Dogs grew thin. People shared crumbs and warmth with them, understanding instinctively that survival was a partnership. A single cow could mean life. Milk for children, manure for fields. Meat if desperation grew absolute. Many chose hunger over slaughter, saving the beast for spring. There was honour in restraint, and sorrow in necessity. The monasteries recorded winters by their severity. Year of the great frost, one scribe wrote, when even the fish beneath the ice died. Another year, famine followed plague, followed rain, followed silence. Yet the script continues, proof that the hand survived long enough to write. In those fragile lines of ink lies the stubborn miracle of persistence. On certain nights, hope appeared disguised as celebration. Candlemas in February brought light to the darkness, the blessing of new candles to last the year. People processed to church, their breath clouding the air, each holding a flickering flame like a heartbeat. They refused to let die. Afterward there might be a small meal, pancakes in some regions, simple cakes in others. Thin, round, symbolic of the sun's return. To eat them was to taste the promise of warmth. For those who lived near forests, hunting offered a dangerous temptation. Deer belonged to lords by law. Poaching was a crime punishable by mutilation or death. Still, hunger ignored decrees. Men crept through the snow at night. boughs hidden beneath cloaks, praying that both God and guard would look away. A single rabbit snared could feed a family for 2 days. They roasted it quickly, bones cracked for marrow, smoke vented through the roof hole like confession. Elsewhere, the sea gave what land denied. Fishermen chopped holes in ice, dropped lines baited with courage, hauled up grey, shivering shapes that gleamed in torchlight. They salted the catch immediately, their fingers bleeding from cold and gratitude. The ocean was winter's last generosity, cruel, unpredictable, necessary. Let's pause in one cottage as night deepens. The wind wails around the doorframe. The fire has dimmed to red breath. A mother ladles the evening stew, thin, steaming, half illusion. Her children hold out bowls carved from wood, so worn the grain has blurred smooth. They eat slowly, each spoonful an act of concentration. Outside, a wolf howls far away, and for a heartbeat, everyone forgets to chew. Then the mother whispers, "Eat, morning will come." It is both comfort and command. Morning always did come, somehow. A grey light crawling through clouds, a rooster defiant against the frost. A reminder that life insisted on continuing. They rose, broke ice in buckets, washed faces with gasps, and trudged into another day of waiting for warmth. It was not optimism that kept them alive. It was routine. Routine disguised itself as faith, and faith disguised itself as work. When March arrived, the hunger deepened paradoxically. The stores were nearly gone, yet spring's gifts not ready. The hungry gap, the cruelest stretch. You could see it on faces, hollowed cheeks, eyes that looked inward. Even laughter sounded slower. Some families boiled the seed grain meant for planting, gambling that the next harvest would forgive them. Others survived on charity from monasteries, whose records speak of bread of mercy baked daily for the poor. It was coarse, mixed with bran and ground peas, but it kept hearts beating. And yet, amid scarcity, small joys bloomed. The first drip of meltwater from the roof, the first bird returning to the hedge, a sprig of green pushing through thawed mud. Children gathered around it as if witnessing magic. In that moment you could feel centuries of collective relief sigh through the soil. Winter's hunger left marks deeper than scars. It shaped culture. It taught patience, gratitude, cooperation. It forged traditions of sharing that survived long after famine faded. When later generations blessed bread or saved leftovers, they echoed those months when waste was sin and survival was grace. In literature, winter became metaphor, the testing of the soul, the measure of endurance. But to the people who lived it, it needed no poetry. It was simply the long cold between one harvest and the next. And yet, they found beauty in it, the stillness of snow, the hush of evenings, the way smoke curled upward, as if prayers had become visible. Imagine walking through such a village at twilight. Snow crunches beneath your feet. Each cottage glows faintly through shutter cracks. Inside, voices murmur, soft, resigned, alive. The smell of burning peat, the crack of a log splitting, the faint laughter of a child who still believes spring will never fail. These are the sounds of victory in slow motion, because winter, for all its cruelty, was also honesty. It stripped the world to essentials: warmth, food, company. It reminded people how little was needed to feel rich: a bowl that wasn't empty, a fire that didn't die, a hand to hold when the wind howled hardest. When finally the thaw came, when puddles reflected the sky again, and the first green haze spread across fields, people walked slower, as if afraid to break the spell. They reopened barns, counted animals still alive, and thanked saints by name for every survivor. The first true loaf from fresh grain was blessed with trembling hands. And when they bit into it, they didn't speak. They just closed their eyes and let the taste of new life erase the memory of the hungry winter. Centuries later, that gratitude lingers quietly in us. Every warm meal, every steaming bowl, is a descendant of those desperate months. We no longer fear famine in most places, but something in our bones still remembers. When we gather at tables, when we light candles against the dark, we reenact the oldest human miracle: to outlast the cold, to feed one another, to hope again. So let the snow fall, let the night deepen. Somewhere a medieval fire still burns behind closed shutters, crackling softly against silence. The people beside it lean close, sharing one last bowl, one last story, and the warmth between them glows brighter than the flame. That is the true light of winter, not in the sky, but in the stubborn, flickering hearts that refuse to go out. Like history itself, rarely changes in a single moment. It drifts almost invisibly, a grain at a time, a recipe altered, a spice remembered, a seed carried by a traveller who does not realize he is changing the future. The Middle Ages began with hunger and ended with curiosity. Between those two states stretched centuries of slow, patient transformation, where every flavor learned to dream a little larger. When people speak of the medieval world, they imagine stillness, centuries that all tasted the same. But that stillness was illusion. Beneath the surface, the palate of Europe was evolving with every trade route, every crusade, every ship that touched a foreign shore. The taste of survival was becoming, slowly, the taste of imagination. Let's go back to the beginning of that shift. It starts not in a kitchen, but on a road, one that winds from the Mediterranean toward the cold north, its stones worn smooth by the sandals of pilgrims, merchants and soldiers. Along that road travelled more than prayers and goods. It carried knowledge of flavour, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, sugar from the East. To the poor, these were rumours, to the rich, revelations. And like all new luxuries, they began as symbols before they became sustenance. Picture a noble feast around the year 1200. The hall glows with torchlight, banners heavy with dust. The scent is extraordinary, not of meat alone but of distant gardens. Dishes glitter with spice, roasted birds glazed with honey and vinegar, stews dyed gold with saffron, sauces sharp with pepper. It was not subtle, it was spectacle. The food of the elite became a performance of wealth, a map of trade written on the tongue. Each bite declared, "I can afford to taste the world." For peasants, the transformation was slower, quieter, but it came all the same. New crops crept into Europe through conquest and connection. Rice found its way north from the Mediterranean. Spinach arrived from Persia, its bright leaves shocking in the dull palate of cabbages. Citrus fruits glowed like lanterns in monastery gardens. Lemons, oranges, bitter and sweet. Sugar, once a spice itself, began to sweeten medicines and rare pastries. Even without tasting them, people dreamed of such flavors. Recipes were spoken like prayers, distant, half-believed, but full of longing. In monastic kitchens, change moved faster. The brothers who copied books also copied recipes. They experimented with herbs, with brewing, with fermentation. Medicinal mixtures bled into cooking, cooking bled into healing. The line between kitchen and apothecary blurred, mint for digestion, sage for strength, vinegar for cleansing. The monastery was the laboratory of medieval taste, humble, methodical, transformative. Trade brought not only ingredients but ideas. Arabs, Byzantines, Jews, and Europeans exchanged recipes the way we exchange stories. From Arabic cuisine came the use of almonds, rice, sugar, and citrus. From the north came butter and beer, from the south olive oil and wine. Every pot in Europe slowly learned a new dialect. The continent was being seasoned by conversation. In the cities where markets grew, taste evolved fastest. Imagine walking through a 14th century market in Venice or Bruges. The air hums with noise, merchants shouting, animals braying, metal clanging. But beneath it all is smell, spices, roasting meat, freshly baked bread. Stalls overflow with colours the countryside never knew. Barrels of pepper, heaps of ginger, candied fruits glittering in sunlight, fish still wet from the sea. Food became theatre, and the senses the audience. Ordinary people rarely bought the expensive spices, but they watched. They learned from scent alone, adapting their own food in imitation. If you couldn't buy pepper, you used mustard seed. If you couldn't buy saffron, you used marigold. Creativity was the poor man's wealth, and the kitchen his workshop. Taste democratized not by price, but by imagination. Let's look at one such home. A peasant woman stirs a pot of pottage much like her mother's, but today she adds something new, a splash of vinegar traded from the town. The stew brightens, her husband tastes and nods, surprised by its sharpness. That tiny change will echo for generations. This is how taste truly evolves, not by decree, but by discovery. The late Middle Ages also saw the rise of guilds, professional bakers, brewers, butchers, cooks. They standardized techniques, guarded secrets, and passed down precision like inheritance. The baker's oven became a place of pride. Yeast was tended like livestock, fed daily, protected from draughts. Bread, once coarse and communal, grew diverse. Rye for the poor, wheat for the rich, but also countless blends in between. Some regions experimented with spices in bread, others shaped it decoratively for festivals. The loaf became language, simple, fragrant, telling of place and time. In the north, butter began its quiet revolution. For centuries, olive oil had been the mark of civilization. Butter was rustic, northern, unsophisticated. But as trade brought oil shortages and tastes shifted, butter rose from peasant kitchens to noble tables. Its richness changed everything. Sauces grew smoother, pastries flakier, flavors rounder. The humble cow began to rival the olive tree. At the same time, preservation improved. Pickling, salting, drying, smoking. These old arts found new refinement. Vinegar became more accessible. Barrels became better sealed. Salt mines expanded. People could now keep not only grain and meat but flavor itself. Winter no longer erased the memory of summer. A jar of preserved apples or a cask of ale became time travel in edible form. But progress was never even. While towns experimented, the countryside remained cautious. Many clung to the tastes of ancestors, fearing that novelty might anger God or upset the body's balance. Medieval medicine believed that food carried humours, heat, cold, dryness, moisture, and health was the art of equilibrium. Too much pepper might inflame the blood, too much lettuce might chill the spirit. Thus, cooks balanced not only flavour, but morality. To eat well was to live rightly, neither indulgent nor ascetic. Even so, temptation grew. The sight of golden crusts, sweet syrups and aromatic spices tested faith as much as sin. Clergy wrote sermons against gluttony, warning that exotic tastes could corrupt the soul, but people listened while licking honey from their fingers. Desire, once awakened, rarely sleeps again. Among the earliest printed books after the Bible were recipe collections. When the printing press arrived, it spread not only words but flavours. The Formy of Cury, compiled by the cooks of King Richard II, listed hundreds of recipes from almond milk stews to meat pies coloured green with parsley. It was both cookbook and cultural manifesto, proof that taste had become knowledge worth preserving. To read such a book was to glimpse a world expanding through the stomach. The slow change of taste also changed the rhythm of daily meals. Where once food had been purely functional, one or two large bowls shared, it now began to separate into courses. Soup first, then meat, then sweets. This sequence mirrored the new philosophy of order and refinement. Eating became performance, even at modest tables. Guests were served by rank, dishes arranged by symmetry. The act of dining evolved from survival to ceremony, and yet, amid all this transformation, the memory of hunger remained. People still fasted, they still blessed their food. Every new flavour carried the ghost of famine. To sweeten a dish was not vanity, it was gratitude disguised as indulgence. Perhaps that is why medieval sweetness tasted so intense, because it was rare, and therefore holy. Outside Europe, empires rose and fell, reshaping trade again. When Constantinople fell in 1453, routes to the east closed, forcing explorers westward. In their wake came new wonders: tomatoes, maize, potatoes, chocolate. But those belong to another chapter. The dawn of the modern world, the medieval palate, ended on the cusp of that discovery, still half-rooted in earth and half dreaming of spice. Let's linger a little before crossing that threshold. A late 15th century kitchen, large hearth, hanging pots, a cat curled in straw. The cook, grey-haired and patient, tastes a sauce thickened with breadcrumbs and almonds. She adjusts it with a dash of vinegar, then adds a few grains of imported pepper. She does not know she is participating in a quiet revolution. To her, it is simply better than yesterday. That is how civilizations change, not by decree, but by a cook deciding that sour and sharp belong together. At the village level, these shifts were slower, but just as profound. People began to bake festive foods, to associate certain flavors with certain days. Honey for Christmas, pancakes for Candlemas, eggs for Easter. Taste became calendar. Seasons no longer meant only scarcity or abundance, they meant identity. Children grew up waiting for the flavors that told them what time of year it was. The slow change of taste was also a slow change of thought. To imagine different flavors was to imagine a larger world. A peasant hearing of pepper from India might never taste it, but he would begin to understand distance, trade, and possibility. Curiosity entered through the mouth and settled in the mind. Food became geography you could chew. By the end of the 15th century, the medieval world had transformed itself almost without noticing. Bread was lighter, soups clearer, sauces smoother, sweet and sour danced together more often. Meals grew more deliberate, less desperate, and underneath it all pulsed a new emotion: pleasure, still guilty but undeniably human. The same people who once prayed for survival now prayed that the stew might taste a little better tomorrow. If you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of that transformation, the scrape of a spoon, the hiss of boiling liquid, the sigh of satisfaction at the first successful experiment. That is the music of progress, gentle, domestic, eternal. Taste would continue to evolve after the Middle Ages, but its roots remained buried in those centuries of patience. The people who endured hunger learned to honor flavor, and their descendants built cuisines from their perseverance. Every spice jar today, every loaf of bread, every glass of wine, is an echo of their slow awakening. And so, as night falls on our long medieval story, the kitchens of Europe glow softly in imagination. Fires burn low, pots bubble quietly, and someone, somewhere, lifts a spoon to taste. The flavor is new, but the gratitude is ancient. It tastes of time itself, slow, smoky, and human. When you listen closely enough, history hums. Not the roar of battles or the clang of armor, but a quieter vibration, the sound of spoons against clay, of bread torn in half, of sighs between bites. That hum is the memory of hunger, and it has never stopped. It murmurs beneath every age, a pulse that connects us to those who lived and ate and hoped long before we named the centuries they inhabited. For all our inventions, our kitchens and convenience, the truth remains the same. We are still creatures built from meals. We live from harvest to harvest, from hunger to relief. The difference is only in degree, not in kind. The poor of the Middle Ages would not recognize our food, but they would recognize our longing to be warm, to be fed, to be together. Imagine, just for a moment, that you could walk through that old world once more. You'd step over frozen furrows, past cottages sunken into earth, and smell smoke, curling from low chimneys. Inside, families huddle by the same eternal fire. On the table, not much. Bread, broth, ale. And yet, something fills the air that cannot be eaten. Gratitude. That sense of enoughness. That fragile calm that follows fear. They are not feasting. They are surviving beautifully. It's easy to forget that our species spent most of its story hungry. Civilization itself grew from that hunger. Every tool, every prayer, every song, every ritual born from the need to make food last just a little longer. The medieval world refined this truth into rhythm. They made hunger holy. They fasted not only because they were told to, but because they understood that the absence of food sharpened the soul. Each empty stomach was a bell reminding them to notice what they had. From that discipline came culture. The taste of bread taught patience. The turning of the seasons taught faith. The waiting for warmth taught hope. Even their stories revolved around nourishment. A saint multiplying loaves. A traveller rewarded with soup. A feast that returns at the end of hardship. To eat was never just to consume. It was to remember, to thank, to continue. And though centuries passed, the echoes of those lessons stayed. In the laughter at a shared table, in the scent of fresh bread, in the way we pause before the first bite. Those are medieval gestures, still alive in our hands. We may not notice it, but the act of eating quietly carries every generation before us. Let's picture one more medieval night. A storm presses against the shutters. The world beyond is black and cold. Inside, a family sits near the hearth. The last loaf rests on the table, its crust dark, its middle still soft. They eat slowly, sparingly. The children lean against their mother. The father watches the fire. No one speaks much. There is nothing new to say. But when the last piece is shared, when the crumbs are gone, they all sit a little closer. That silence is not emptiness. It is peace. The next morning, the same family will wake early, pull on stiff boots, and step into the pale light of another uncertain day. They will work, they will ache, they will laugh when they can. And when they return to that same table at dusk, they will begin again, the eternal ritual of hunger and fulfillment. That rhythm shaped Europe's spirit as much as any war or invention. Hunger taught cooperation. No one could survive alone. Villages pooled grain, shared ovens, traded eggs for herbs, balanced one another's losses with quiet generosity. In that sharing, community was born. The bread that passed from hand to hand was not just food, it was a promise. Even faith was seasoned by hunger. The words of prayer were soaked in the logic of the kitchen. Give us this day our daily bread. No philosophy could express dependence more clearly. It was not metaphorical bread they asked for. It was the literal loaf that kept them alive. That single line carried centuries of frost, famine, and gratitude. Even today, when those words are spoken, they summon not theology, but the memory of empty bowls filled again. Over time, the shape of hunger changed. Famine receded slowly with better harvests, new crops, new trade. But the feeling, the ancient ache, lingered. People still measured success by how full their tables looked. They still built rituals around food, Sunday dinners, harvest festivals, fasting before holidays. Each act a reenactment of survival turned into celebration. It's strange to think that hunger, which once ruled human life with cruelty, became the mother of gratitude, art, and civilization. Without it, we might never have learned empathy. Only those who have gone hungry understand the holiness of sharing, and only those who have endured scarcity know how miraculous an ordinary meal can feel. When historians write of the Middle Ages, they speak of knights and cathedrals, of crusades and kings, but the truest monument of that era was not made of stone, it was made of dough and patience. It was the bread that never stopped rising, even when hope fell flat. Hunger also shaped imagination. Every dream of heaven was painted in the colours of a feast, tables overflowing, cups never empty, bread without end. In that vision, the poor found comfort, the promise that the next world would finally be full. Perhaps that belief sustained them more than any actual meal. When your stomach is empty, eternity must taste of abundance. Let's step now into the end of the 15th century, as the medieval age begins to dim and the modern world stirs awake. Ships have started crossing oceans. New foods are coming: tomatoes, potatoes, maize, cocoa. The palette of the future gleams just beyond the horizon. But the people of that time do not yet know what is arriving. They still cling to the old rituals, the old fears. In their hearts, winter has not ended. Somewhere, a baker kneads dough in silence. His hands are cracked, his flour coarse. He will sell most of his loaves to others, but he keeps one for himself, wrapped in cloth against the night. When he finally sits to eat, he breaks it slowly, as if afraid the bread might vanish before his eyes. The first bite tastes of ash and labour, the second of life. That is the flavour that carried humanity forward. The echo of that bite still lives in us. We chase comfort, luxury, indulgence, but somewhere deep in our genes, is the memory of earning each meal. That memory hums in our love for slow cooking, in our fascination with recipes, in the satisfaction of feeding others. We are, all of us, descendants of the hungry, and if we close our eyes while eating, we can almost feel them near the peasants, the monks, the mothers who stirred endless pots of barley and beans. They lean close, invisible, listening to our spoons. Every meal is communion with them. Their world ended, but their rhythm didn't. It beats on in our kitchens, quiet and sure. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Middle Ages. Not the architecture of stone, but the architecture of sustenance. They taught us to build life out of repetition, to wake, to work, to cook, to share. Their art was survival, their beauty the balance between hunger and grace. Each generation learned that lesson anew, and each left behind the same instruction: feed one another, and you will endure. When you next hold a piece of bread, think of that line of hands stretching backward through time. 1,000 bakers, 1,000 fires, 1,000 storms survived for that moment to exist. Their fingerprints are in the flour. Their smoke still lingers in the crust. Their patience became your abundance. The echo of hunger is not sorrow. It is gratitude made audible. It reminds us how fragile comfort is, how miraculous survival has always been. It teaches us that every meal, however small, is an answered prayer. We didn't know we were still whispering. So tonight, as we leave this long journey through the kitchens and fields of the past, let the story settle like warmth in your chest. Picture the last medieval fire fading, the last spoon scraping a wooden bowl. Outside, frost creeps over the fields again, but inside, the air is soft with breath and memory. The people close their eyes, fed for one more day. They have done enough. And somewhere, across the centuries, their peace becomes ours. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like or just let the story carry you to sleep. Good night.